Good evening, Royal Leamington Spa. I'm Jaap Blonk. I will, upon special request, do a short talk about sound poetry and a bit about the history and what it's all about. And I will project some examples on this wall over here. After the talk, I will do a performance, and I will be on that side. So there will be a very short pause where we will move my stuff that way, and you can move your chairs more to this side to be able to look at that side. And while we'll be doing that, we'll be treated to a piece of glossolalia on tape. I have understood speaking in tongues. So, let me say a few words about how I got into sound poetry. Well, for those of you who've never heard the term sound poetry, is considered poetry that's where the sound is more important than the meaning, and sometimes there is no meaning at all. At some point in the 1970s, I had quit my study of mathematics, and I was looking for other things to do. I was interested in poetry and music. I was playing saxophone and drifting towards the free improvised music, making all the possible and impossible sounds on the instrument. And I was doing some courses in various creative fields. And in the course of poetry, recitation of poetry, I stumbled upon some sound poems, and those were really, that was a big discovery for me. It was like finding a new homeland. It was a sort of no man's land between music on the one hand and poetry or literature on the other hand, but I fell in love with those strange, meaningless poems, and I started to recite them, and after 3 years or so, I began to organize little performances, or I was asked to perform, and so the thing got into rolling, and a few years later, I started to improvise with the voice instead of on the saxophone. So I'll show you a few examples of early sound poetry. Sound poetry is very old. It's been around as long as mankind. There are examples of meaningless poetry in many formulae for rituals in cultures, but it was around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century that poets began to consider these poems or present them as poems or as art, and this is one of the early examples by German poet Paul Scherbart, and he published a few sound poems or nonsense poems in a book of German poetry. This is by a contemporary of him, Christian Morgenstern, Das große Lalula, or the great Lalula, featuring the line lalu 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 la several times, and it's in a book also mainly consisting of German poems entitled Galgenlieder, or Songs of the Gallows. By Morgenstern is this poem also. It's one of the most famous early experimental poems. It's entitled Fisch's Nachtgesang, or The Night Song of the Fish. And many interpretations have been done of it. My favorite one is like the closing and opening of the mouth of the fish. So. And so on. This one is by Hugo Ball, who was one of the founders of the Dada movement in 1916. And he wrote 6 sound poems that he performed at the famous Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, Switzerland, where the Dada movement originated. And for him it was also the Dada was, besides a revolt against the antiquated and, well, for them, very boring romantic art, it was also a protest against the madness of war. In the middle of the First World War, a group of exiled artists in the neutral country Switzerland, and they said the modern European languages, English, German, French, have been polluted by, they've been made dirty by all the war propaganda that has been made in them. And indeed, in the years before the First World War, all these countries were happy to go into a Fröhliche Krieg, a fresh and joyful war, and which then, of course, became a tragedy with millions of people killed. Ballot said we need to, we cannot write any poetry anymore in these languages. We have to invent new languages to be able to write pure poetry. This is another one by Bal, Caravan or Caravan. This one's by Rudolf Hausmann a few years later, 1919, in Berlin. And he said, we must take a next step, not like Hugo Ball, give our poems German names or meaningful names, but abstract names. This one is called Phonetic Poem, and the poem to look at and to speak, and is he took the size of the letters as a measure for the volume, for the dynamics, so something like and so on. So we get a dynamic recitation. This is actually was done by him on a big format, like a poster, and he. It came about by accident because he had access to a print shop where he could use the letters that had been thrown away because they were damaged or worn out. So that's why he has all the fonts and different fonts and sizes mixed up. This is by the Dutch artist Theo van Dusberg, founder of the magazine and movement The Style. So he's more known as a visual artist. I will perform some of these in the performance. They're entitled Letterklankbeelden or letter sound images, written in 1921. And at that time he didn't dare to publish them under his own name. He used the pseudonym I.K. Bonset, which is sort of an anagram of the Dutch phrase Ik ben zot or I am crazy. This is one of the most radical Dada poems. It's by Man Ray, the French photographer and filmmaker, 1924. And to me, as soon as I saw this, I had the idea this is a very rude act of censorship. A poem that has been, well, you know, made completely unreadable. So when I perform, I use a very aggressive sound, and sometimes ask the audience to join in. It's, which you can find on Uberweb. And this when you don't know this website, it's a fantastic resource for sound poetry. It's just ubu.com, and you find recordings of not only of sound poetry but of lots of abstract films and other early avant-garde compositions in music and in poetry. It's it would take thousands of hours to listen to all this stuff and look at it. I will also perform tonight one movement of the so-called Ur-Sonata or primitive sonata or sonata in primordial sounds by Kurt Schwitters, which is considered the masterpiece of early sound poetry written between 1922 and 32. All this sound poetry before the Second World War has been exists only as text. There are very few recordings by the authors. Only after 1945, when tape recorders were available, their sound poets started to more conceive their work as recordings instead of as text. I will just move very briefly in to a few of my own scores. This is a piece I wrote in homage to Antonin Artaud, the French visionary surrealist poet and theatre pioneer, featuring, I will also perform this piece in my performance, featuring French words, fake French words that have the like in French, the word accent on the last syllable, so you get a theme like and in this middle section, very long consonants. In sound poetry, the consonants have much more value than in most styles of singing. In singing, the consonants are just short stepping stones between long drawn vowels, and this section is just the opposite, very short vowels and long consonants. And so on. So to find fascinating timbres in consonants and just almost skip the vowels. This is a poem inspired by the early Bebop, when it was like in the mid-40s, when it was invented by Charlie Parker and others, and still was fresh and alive and not yet taught in conservatories. And this it has the form of a bebop, of many of the bebop pieces, an AABA form. So that normally normally, of course, there's a solo in the bebop piece. This is a short educative talk, so well, these were two examples of sound poems written with the normal alphabet, the Russian alphabet, and with the instruction of the first one pronounce it as if it were French, and the other one as if it were Dutch. But I started to find that too much of a limitation, and I studied some phonetics, learned the international phonetic alphabet, like it is used in dictionaries to indicate the pronunciation of words. And these are a few of the first phrases I wrote in the international phonetic alphabet. Ring. So you see there are many more signs than in a regular Western alphabet, and also signs over and under the letters. For instance, this little thing under the U means creaky voice. And then there's this tilde over this letter, that's the O, but it makes this into a nasal O. And this sign over the inverted E's, like makes it a very short syllable, almost no syllable, agdeboe. And this below the M makes it separate syllables, so not connected. Up, and this is capital M was one of the first signs I invented to add to the phonetic alphabet, because I noticed there were quite a few sounds that were not represented in the alphabet. So this sound and the sound up, body by. This is another notation done in the International Phonetic Alphabet, early one. And then this is the first of a series of what they call phonetic etudes. And this whole piece is only about the R, one of the most fascinating letters I find of the alphabet, because there's so many different pronunciation of the R, like or the throat, or the English, or the North American so-called Retroflex. It's a Retroflex because the tip of the tongue tends to be backwards against the palate. So this is a score where you have to start in the top left corner and end in the right bottom corner, but between that the order is free. The arrows that are drawn in here represent the specific order of a recording I did of the piece. This is out of the CD booklet of my first solo CD, Flux the Bush. Here we have this last sound with a big dot, with very big pressure, and in the early stage I still wrote some instructions in terms of sounds that were similar. This in red says grasmaaier, or a lawn mower, but an old-fashioned one that you have to push, something like that. And here we have a back and forth between an English and North American R, but with inhaling sound. Arrows to the left represent for me, in my notation, inhaling. So on. Here we have a French throat R with a voiced R going up and down in pitch. And the instruction says light motorcycle. And this is a voiced R with more melodic contours. And this is North American R, but with lots of pressure. So you get, as it were, a band of parallel frequencies that goes up and down together. This is another phonetic etude where about the unvoiced fricatives, which are the hissing sounds, of the sounds that are made by friction of air without the vocal cords sounding, and systematically from the very front of the mouth at the two lips, gradually all the way back to the glottis, where the vocal cords are, which is the relaxed. It's a lot of rectangle, there are manual manipulations of the sounds. So, for instance, for the F, I have for the sh, I would and for the this piece goes on with this kind of ongoing rhythm, and also these sounds can be made inhaling as well as exhaling. So I was able to make a piece of about 5 minutes without having to stop for breathing. This is another one. I will present a later worked out version in the performance tonight, where there's different sounds at the two corners of the mouth. Here we have a notation for trying to prolong a B and a P. You have for the B and for the P.
where the P has more pressure, and that results in a faster vibration of the lips, so we have a faster waveform and a slower waveform. This is a later version of the same piece, where these all these red, so primitive hands indicate specific specific manipulations of the cheeks and the throat. And this is about so-called approximants, where that's sounds, voice sounds that are made when parts of the mouth get close to each other but don't quite touch. For instance, like the whoa, 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 whoa here at the lips, and then this is the represents the space between the lips and the teeth, which are here, and then this is the y, this is the r, and here is the n and the those are not approximants, but this is a more free-form piece where you can improvise on everything that's indicated here, including these more or less possible and impossible diagrams of tongue positions. This is a very different piece I wrote based on, it's called Trans-Siberian, after the famous train in Russia, and it's based on two characters of the Russian, of the Cyrillic alphabet, the sh and the ts. So this is sort of the beginning of the journey. This is when the train is at full speed. And so on. And this is when it stops again in Vladivostok. This was a score where this is actually notated on a square piece of cardboard. So you have to turn it 90 degrees every time to be able to read on, and the phonetic signs are notated on the at each section. So you get something like results, and I also performed it with my ensemble Splinks, where the turns of the board were cues for the group to go to the next section, which they had notated in their scores. This is a sort of a freer form of phonetic signs where they lead a life of their own. They're sort of making faces at me, you could say. And so I got more and more into visual poetry. This is called Plotland, and this is not very visible, I skipped this one. And a series of what I call phone embraces of phonemes, where two or more letters embrace each other. This is more or less the same principle, combinations of letters of the phonetic alphabet. And then there's a series of what I call traces of speech, where there are still some traces of phonetic signs, but the things are not really functional anymore. So here, this is a phonetic sign, and this here, and here are some, but the others are more or less derived from. So I think that, well, if there are, I should ask after the talk, are there any questions? If not, I will just have this little break where I move this way, and you, if you wish, can move that way. And any questions?
Yeah.
All right.
How often do you get told that you're completely nuts? That you're completely nuts. Does that happen often?
Are you serious?